Lord Chair, and thank you, gentlemen. You made the comment during your evidence that crises can be brought forward earlier than is convenient, and you've both reminded us of a lack of preparedness in the Falklands and Iraq and in other situations as they've emerged. Obviously, building on the answers you've just given to us about Ukraine, I'd like to ask you to drill deeper into that question, if you would. Has the Russian invasion of Ukraine posed challenges which were already anticipated or new ones? And over, 2 months into Putin's war, looking at the way the conflict has evolved, do you think that we need at this stage, maybe it's too early to say, but should the UK start to rethink its strategy and its defence policy, or are our priorities and our capabilities to defend them basically sound ones?
It's too early in some respects, because we're very influenced by certain images. So we've seen, as happens with most wars, small, very cheap things knocking out large, very expensive things. And it happens, and it will happen in future wars. So, in an age of drones and highly precise anti-tank weapons and so on, why do you need tanks? And that issue, it's a real issue. But if you need mobility, then what you're moving in has to be protected, and it has to take its firepower with it, and you end up looking rather like a tank. So it's going to be there's going to be too many lessons in some ways drawn from limited information and images. A lot of people have been trying to point out that though the anti-tank weapons really did make a difference, they were terribly important. Artillery is still critical on this battlefield, and artillery is always critical on any battlefield. So there's certain lessons that are going to be learnt of that sort. The basic lessons are broadly strategic, and the lesson we hope others learn is this was really a stupid idea, and that military force doesn't solve your problems for you easily, and you can get yourself into a lot of trouble if you convince yourself you're going to have a decisive win in a few days. It's a lesson we hope other countries will learn. We've had our own difficult lessons to learn as well on those grounds. Secondly, logistics is always important. Yeah. Most wars of any length are logistics wars, and this is no exception. The Russians prioritized elite units, armor, paras, and didn't put enough into logistics, and they suffered accordingly. And it's a big drag on them. Third command, there's going to be big issues about. Arguably, the Ukrainian experience validates Western concepts of mission command and delegated authority, and so on. The Russian system has been too rigid and cumbersome, so there's all these stories about the forces doing the same thing over and over again and getting battered each time because they didn't get new orders. So there are lessons to be learned about command. For the UK, there's a lot of things we've talked about already, especially in terms of consumption of materiel. I think what happened is in line with the integrated review. You can't say the integrated review didn't prepare us potentially for something like this. And, to be frank, the UK response has been pretty good. But it's a political commitment that made the difference, and the commitment that was made before the invasion began. It was the use of intelligence to warn of what could happen. It was the readiness to send systems to Ukraine before the battle began. These were the things that really made the difference. And these are political strategic judgments that you can't plan for in advance. They're things that you need to think about. Just final point, I think the hardest thing for us to get our heads around, and it's too early, I don't think it's too early to start talking about perhaps, is the possibility of the implications of a Russian loss. I mean, they're not going to win, but we're not sure yet if they're actually going to lose. Maybe a bit of a draw, but they could lose. Now, a lot of what we've been thinking and talking about throughout the West in terms of defence has been these two great powers challenging us, Russia and China. Well, what happens if one of them looks a much diminished power in the future, looks inward? It could go a variety of ways. That's why it's too early to start drawing conclusions from that. But this is going to be have an enormous impact over the long term, because our sense of where the real challenges of European security may change may be as substantial as those that took place sort of in the decade from the late 80s to the late 90s, when we started off seeing the evaporation of one great threat and then ended up fighting in places where we never expected to fight. So that, I think, is the thing that we're waiting for in some ways, is to see what sort of new security order emerges out of all of this.
I think on a note of congratulation to the integrated review and the command paper, I think what's happened in Ukraine has vindicated some of what it said, that the emphasis on intelligence, on reconnaissance, on Five Eyes. This has been lethal to Russia's invading force, the ability to fix, find and destroy or disable Russia's advancing capabilities, and in time, with the cooperation of allies, has been a very impressive coordinated effort. In other respects, I think there's some gaps here. I remember something was said at the time to support the integrated review, not so long ago. Quote from the MOD: capability will be less defined by numbers of people and platforms than by information-centric technologies, automation and a culture of innovation and experimentation. I think that's not untrue. I think it's a half-truth, that scale counts. Firepower, logistics, materiel count. Numbers of people and platforms count. Who thought we'd be living in a time when Russia's running out of men, who are trained personnel who can carry on a conflict? I think there are some other dangers here it's a deeply political thing to ask defences and defence intellectuals to interpret the lessons of a recent war, because they tend to go and try and find the things that suit their arguments. So people like me will be telling you about the huge importance of artillery and firepower, and others will say, no, the huge importance of sort of combat teams. And I guess trying to work out what is the optimal effectiveness of what combined arms system has worked between small teams, large teams, between light weaponry, heavy weaponry, intelligence. And I think the jury is still out to a certain extent, because we don't know everything that's happened. I think it has posed a challenge, though, to what was becoming an over-fashionable idea that the future of warfare, in a sense, is almost emptied of the battle space. It's about kind of information, narrative, sub-threshold mischief, that sort of thing. Well, those are things that happen when your deterrence system is working. But this was a case where deterrence didn't work, and this is another problem with the integrated review. There was an assumption that involvement in support for Ukraine would help deter an invasion. Well, it didn't. Now, you can argue we should have done more earlier, but that may well have drawn an earlier invasion. Russia has taken that risk, not just because it's miscalculated, although it has. It's also calculated that Ukraine matters intensely and it's willing to run certain risks. So we have to think again about what are we trying to deter, where are we trying to deter, and on what basis are we making those gambles.
You said earlier in your remarks that we have a two-hemisphere strategy with a one-hemisphere navy. And you've both referred to the position of China and the gravitational pull of Asia. And indeed, in your excellent paper that you circulated to us in advance, Escalators and Quagmires, you said that President Xi must already be wondering if he backed the wrong horse. I wonder if you could explore that a little bit more for us, and where, given what you said to us, Professor Porter, just before about Taiwan, do you think the situation is more dangerous, less dangerous? You talked about engagement or embroilment and the danger of being sucked in. You haven't mentioned AUKUS as such, but the international alliances that we have. Where does it leave us? Where does Ukraine leave us in that context?
Well, look, I think it follows from the answer to my previous answer, which is let's see how this ends. But if it ends as it seems to be going at the moment, it's a big deal for China. First, because they bet on Putin. Xi met him in Beijing a couple of weeks before the invasion took place, and whether he told him what he was planning to do, well, it's bad if he did, and in some ways it's bad if he didn't. But what's happened is going to appear pretty alarming, because it's a reminder, which is a good reminder, as I said before, of the pitfalls of military operations and how they don't always turn out as you expect. And I think it's going to produce tension between Russia and China. If this does leave Russia as a diminished power, China is a very big presence on their border. It wasn't that long ago that one of the dominant features of international politics was tension between Russia and China. Russia had numerous divisions in its Far East. That issue could well re-emerge. The other question is what it says about American leadership. We haven't talked much about the Americans. When that was damaged, first by President Trump's indifference, let's say, to alliances, and then, although President Biden was more in favour of them, he didn't really handle the withdrawal from Afghanistan particularly well, and I think that was a factor which encouraged a view of Western decline. Well, President Biden has stepped up with this crisis and has shown leadership and is organising allies and saying the right things, so that it's sort of a positive after some negatives about the role generally of the Western alliance. And I would say, when we think about Indo-Pacific, I don't see much point of us thinking about it other than with the Americans. We're not going to be involved in the things that we can do, but AUKUS is a good example that we're demonstrating that we're good allies of the Americans. We can work closely with them. If the Americans aren't interested in something, there's not a lot, whether in America or Europe, that we can do. So I think as this crisis subsides, the China issue will come back into focus, but it'll be a different world in which this happens. And I think you can already see signs of pressure on Xi, which isn't helped, I think, by his COVID response within the Chinese system, as to whether actually this autocracy is producing all the right answers to the problems that China faces. So I think a lot of people are going to be looking for not necessarily sort of great massive change in Beijing, but a certain reappraisal of how they've comported themselves internationally in recent years, and whether they can be quite as confident that the future is theirs as they seemed to be not so long ago.
I have some darker thoughts on this one. On the one hand, of course, it's true that Russia, as a diminished, depleted power, in a direct sense, is less dangerous. It has less ability to menace NATO, etc. On the other hand, the increasingly lopsidedness of the Beijing-Moscow axis, I would call. I think there is a tightening relationship of cooperation, convergence against a common enemy, means that in other respects the problem gets worse. That Russia is almost forced to become a subordinate client state and supplier and support and source of raw materials to China. And at the same time, there is still the capacity, while China, which is still growing, which is still launching a bid for hegemony in Asia, while there's a potential crisis in Asia, at the same time Russia still has enough legacy ability, not to overrun countries or water its horses in the Thames, but to cause a crisis on NATO's eastern flank. And it's going to be very hard in practice with the bandwidth. I don't need to tell this audience about bandwidth and the difficulty of dealing with more than one thing at a time as in a crisis. To have multiple crises at the same time on NATO's eastern flank, across the Taiwan Strait, at the same time as we've got this, of course, this economic cost of living crisis at home. Russia still has the ability to act as spoiler in that sense, and at the same time, it strengthens China's position